HEIDI, by Johanna Spyri. Chapter 4. The Visit to Grandmother. The next morning the sun came out early, as bright as ever, and then Peter appeared with the goats, and again the two children climbed up together to the high meadows, and so it went on day after day till HEIDI, passing her life thus among the grass and flowers, was burnt brown with the sun, and grew so strong and healthy that nothing ever ailed her. She was happy too, and lived from day to day as free and light-hearted as the little birds that make their home among the green forest trees. Then the autumn came, and the wind blew louder and stronger, and the grandfather would say sometimes, "Today you must stay at home, HEIDI." A sudden gust of the wind would blow a little thing like you over the rocks into the valley below in a moment. Whenever Peter heard that he must go alone, he looked very unhappy, for he saw nothing but mishaps of all kinds ahead, and did not know how he should bear the long dull day without HEIDI. Then, too, there was the good meal he would miss, and besides that the goats on these days were so naughty and obstinate that he had twice the usual trouble with them, for they had grown so accustomed to HEIDI's presence that they would run in every direction and refuse to go on unless she was with them. HEIDI was never unhappy, for wherever she was she found something to interest or amuse her. She liked best, it is true, to go out with Peter up to the flowers and the great bird, where there was so much to be seen, and so many experiences to go through among the goats with their different characters. But she also found her grandfather's hammering and sawing and carpentering very entertaining, and if it should chance to be the day when the large round goat's milk cheese was made, she enjoyed beyond measure looking on at this wonderful performance, and watching her grandfather, as with sleeves rolled back, he stirred the great cauldron with his bare arms. The thing which attracted her most, however, was the waving and roaring of the three old fir trees on these windy days. She would run away repeatedly from whatever she might be doing, to listen to them, for nothing seemed so strange and wonderful to her as the deep mysterious sound in the tops of the trees. She would stand underneath them and look up, unable to tear herself away, looking and listening while they bowed and swayed and roared as the mighty wind rushed through them. There was no longer now the warm bright sun that had shone all through the summer, so HEIDI went to the cupboard and got out her shoes and stockings and dress, for it was growing colder every day, and when HEIDI stood under the fir trees the wind blew through her as if she was a thin little leaf. But still she felt she could not stay indoors when she heard the branches waving outside. Then it grew very cold, and Peter would come up early in the morning blowing on his fingers to keep them warm. But he soon left off coming, for one night there was a heavy fall of snow, and the next morning the whole mountain was covered with it, and not a single little green leaf was to be seen anywhere upon it. There was no Peter that day, and HEIDI stood at the little window looking out in wonderment, for the snow was beginning again, and the thick flakes kept falling till the snow was up to the window, and still they continued to fall, and the snow grew higher, so that at last the window could not be opened, and she and her grandfather were shut up fast within the hut. HEIDI thought this was great fun and ran from one window to the other to see what would happen next, and whether the snow was going to cover up the whole hut, so that they would have to light a lamp although it was broad daylight. But things did not get as bad as that, and the next day, the snow having ceased, the grandfather went out and shoveled away the snow round the house, and threw it into such great heaps that they looked like mountains standing at intervals on either side the hut. And now the windows and door could be opened, and it was well it was so, for as HEIDI and her grandfather were sitting one afternoon on their three-legged stools before the fire, there came a great thump with the door, followed by several others, and then the door opened. It was Peter, who had made all that noise knocking the snow off his shoes. He was still white all over with it, for he had had to fight his way through deep snowdrifts, and large lumps of snow that had frozen upon him still clung to his clothes. He had been determined, however, not to be beaten and to climb up to the hut, for it was a week now since he had seen HEIDI. "Good evening," he said as he came in. Then he went and placed himself as near the fire as he could without saying another word, but his whole face was beaming with pleasure at finding himself there. HEIDI looked on in astonishment, for Peter was beginning to thaw all over with the warmth, so that he had the appearance of a trickling waterfall. "Well, General, and how goes it with you?" said the grandfather. "Now that you have lost your army you will have to turn to your pen and pencil." "Why must he turn to his pen and pencil?" asked HEIDI immediately, full of curiosity. "During the winter he must go to school," explained her grandfather, "and learn how to read and write. It's a bit hard, although useful sometimes afterwards. Am I not right, General?" "Yes, indeed," assented Peter. HEIDI's interest was now thoroughly awakened, and she had so many questions to put to Peter about all that was to be done and seen and heard at school, and the conversation took so long that Peter had time to get thoroughly dry. Peter had always great difficulty in putting his thoughts into words, and he found his share of the talk doubly difficult today, for by the time he had an answer ready to one of HEIDI's questions she had already put 2 or 3 more to him, and generally such as required a whole long sentence in reply. The grandfather sat without speaking during this conversation. Only now and then a twitch of amusement at the corners of his mouth showed that he was listening. "Well, now, General, you have been under fire for some time and must want some refreshment. Come and join us," he said at last, and as he spoke he rose and went to fetch the supper out of the cupboard, and HEIDI pushed the stools to the table. There was also now a bench fastened against the wall, for as he was no longer alone the grandfather had put up seats of various kinds here and there, long enough to hold 2 persons, for HEIDI had a way of always keeping close to her grandfather whether he was walking, sitting or standing, so there was comfortable place for them all 3, and Peter opened his round eyes very wide when he saw what a large piece of meat uncle gave him on his thick slice of bread. It was a long time since Peter had had anything so nice to eat. As soon as the pleasant meal was over Peter began to get ready for returning home, for it was already growing dark. He had said his good night and his thanks, and was just going out, when he turned again and said, "I shall come again next Sunday, this day week, and grandmother sent word that she would like you to come and see her one day." It was quite a new idea to HEIDI that she should go and pay anybody a visit, and she could not get it out of her head. So the first thing she said to her grandfather the next day was, "I must go down to see the grandmother today. She will be expecting me." "The snow is too deep," answered the grandfather, trying to put her off, but HEIDI had made up her mind to go. Since the grandmother had sent her that message, she stuck to her intention and not a day passed but what in the course of it she said 5 or 6 times to her grandfather, "I must certainly go today. The grandmother will be waiting for me." On the 4th day, when with every step one took the ground crackled with frost and the whole vast field of snow was hard as ice, HEIDI was sitting on her high stool at dinner with the bright sun shining in upon her through the window, and again repeated her little speech. "I must certainly go down to see the grandmother today, or else I shall keep her waiting too long." The grandfather rose from table, climbed up to the hayloft and brought down the thick sack that was HEIDI's coverlid, and said, "Come along then." The child skipped out gleefully after him into the glittering world of snow. The old fir trees were standing now quite silent, their branches covered with the white snow, and they looked so lovely as they glittered and sparkled in the sunlight that HEIDI jumped for joy at the sight and kept on calling out, "Come here, grandfather." The fir trees are all silver and gold. The grandfather had gone into the shed and he now came out dragging a large hand sleigh along with him. Inside it was a low seat, and the sleigh could be pushed forward and guided by the feet of the one who sat upon it with the help of a pole that was fastened to the side. After he had been taken round the fir trees by Heidi that he might see their beauty from all sides, he got into the sleigh and lifted the child onto his lap. Then he wrapped her up in the sack, that she might keep nice and warm, and put his left arm closely round her, for it was necessary to hold her tight during the coming journey. He now grasped the pole with his right hand and gave the sleigh a push forward with his 2 feet. The sleigh shot down the mountainside with such rapidity that Heidi thought they were flying through the air like a bird, and shouted aloud with delight. Suddenly they came to a standstill, and there they were at Peter's hut. Her grandfather lifted her out and unwrapped her. "There you are. Now go in, and when it begins to grow dark you must start on your way home again." Then he left her and went up the mountain, pulling his sleigh after him. Heidi opened the door of the hut and stepped into a tiny room that looked very dark, with a fireplace and a few dishes on a wooden shelf. This was the little kitchen. She opened another door, and now found herself in another small room, for the place was not a herdsman's hut like her grandfather's, with one large room on the ground floor and a hayloft above, but a very old cottage, where everything was narrow and poor and shabby. A table was close to the door, and as Heidi stepped in she saw a woman sitting at it, putting a patch on a waistcoat which Heidi recognized at once as Peter's. In the corner sat an old woman, bent with age, spinning. Heidi was quite sure this was the grandmother, so she went up to the spinning wheel and said, "Good day, grandmother. I have come at last. Did you think I was a long time coming?" The woman raised her head and felt for the hand that the child held out to her, and when she found it, she passed her own over it thoughtfully for a few seconds, and then said, "Are you the child who lives up with uncle? Are you Heidi?" "Yes, yes," answered Heidi. "I have just come down in the sleigh with grandfather. Is it possible? Why, your hands are quite warm. Brigitte, did uncle come himself with the child?" Peter's mother had left her work and risen from the table and now stood looking at Heidi with curiosity, scanning her from head to foot. "I do not know, mother, whether uncle came himself. It is hardly likely. The child probably makes a mistake." But Heidi looked steadily at the woman, not at all as if in any uncertainty, and said, "I know quite well who wrapped me in my bed cover and brought me down in the sleigh. It was grandfather." There was some truth then perhaps in what Peter used to tell us of uncle during the summer, when we thought he must be wrong, said grandmother. But who would ever have believed that such a thing was possible? I did not think the child would live 3 weeks up there. What is she like, Brigitte? The latter had so thoroughly examined Heidi on all sides that she was well able to describe her to her mother. She has Adelaide's slenderness of figure, but her eyes are dark and her hair curly like her father's and the old man's up there. She takes after both of them, I think. Heidi meanwhile had not been idle. She had made the round of the room and looked carefully at everything there was to be seen. All of a sudden she exclaimed, "Grandmother, one of your shutters is flapping backwards and forwards. Grandfather would put a nail in and make it all right in a minute, or else it will break one of the panes some day. Look, look, how it keeps on banging." "Ah, dear child," said the old woman, "I am not able to see it, but I can hear that and many other things besides the shutter. Everything about the place rattles and creaks when the wind is blowing, and it gets inside through all the cracks and holes. The house is going to pieces, and in the night, when the 2 others are asleep, I often lie awake in fear and trembling, thinking that the whole place will give way and fall and kill us, and there is not a creature to mend anything for us, for Peter does not understand such work. But why cannot you see, grandmother, that the shutter is loose? Look, there it goes again. See, that one there. And Heidi pointed to the particular shutter. Alice, child, it is not only that I cannot see, I can see nothing, nothing, said the grandmother in a voice of lamentation. But if I were to go outside and put back the shutter so that you had more light, then you could see, grandmother. No, no, not even then. No one can make it light for me again. But if you were to go outside among all the white snow, then surely you would find it light. Just come with me, grandmother, and I will show you. Heidi took hold of the old woman's hand to let her along, for she was beginning to feel quite distressed at the thought of her being without light. Let me be, dear child. It is always dark for me now, whether in snow or sun. No light can penetrate my eyes. But surely it is in summer, grandmother, said Heidi, more and more anxious to find some way out of the trouble, when the hot sun is shining down again, and he says good night to the mountains, and they all turn on fire, and the yellow flowers shine like gold. Then, you will see, it will be bright and beautiful for you again. Ah, child, I shall see the mountains on fire or the yellow flowers no more. It will never be light for me again on earth, never. At these words Heidi broke into loud crying. In her distress she kept on sobbing out, "Who can make it light for you again? Can no one do it? Isn't there anyone who can do it?" The grandmother now tried to comfort the child, but it was not easy to quiet her. Heidi did not often weep, but when she did she could not get over her trouble for a long while. The grandmother had tried all means in her power to allay the child's grief, for it went to her heart to hear her sobbing so bitterly. At last she said, "Come here, dear Heidi, come and let me tell you something. You cannot think how glad one is to hear a kind word when one can no longer see, and it is such a pleasure to me to listen to you while you talk. So come and sit beside me and tell me something. Tell me what you do up there, and how grandfather occupies himself. I knew him very well in old days, but for many years now I have heard nothing of him, except through Peter, who never says much." This was a new and happy idea to Heidi. She quickly dried her tears and said in a comforting voice, "Wait, grandmother, till I have told grandfather everything. He will make it light for you again, I am sure, and will do something so that the house will not fall. He will put everything right for you." The grandmother was silent, and Heidi now began to give her a lively description of her life with the grandfather, and of the day she spent on the mountain with the goats, and then went on to tell her of what she did now during the winter, and how her grandfather was able to make all sorts of things, seats and stools, and mangers where the hay was put for Little Swan and Little Bear, besides a new large water tub for her to bathe in when the summer came, and a new milk bowl and spoon. And Heidi grew more and more animated as she enumerated all the beautiful things which were made so magically out of pieces of wood. She then told the grandmother how she stood by him and watched all he did, and how she hoped someday to be able to make the same herself. The grandmother listened with the greatest attention, only from time to time addressing her daughter. "Do you hear that, Brigitte? Do you hear what she is saying about Uncle?" The conversation was all at once interrupted by a heavy thump on the door, and in marched Peter, who stood stock still, opening his eyes with astonishment, when he caught sight of Heidi. Then his face beamed with smiles as she called out, "Good evening, Peter." "What, is the boy back from school already?" exclaimed the grandmother in surprise. "I have not known an afternoon pass so quickly as this one for years. How is the reading getting on, Peter?" "Just the same," was Peter's answer. The old woman gave a little sigh. "Ah, well," she said, I hoped you would have something different to tell me by this time, as you were going to be 12 years old this February. What was it that you hoped he would have to tell you?" asked Heidi, interested in all the grandmother said. "I mean that he ought to have learned to read a bit by now," continued the grandmother. "Up there on the shelf is an old prayer book, with beautiful songs in it which I have not heard for a long time and cannot now remember to repeat to myself, and I hope that Peter would soon learn enough to be able to read one of them to me sometimes, but he finds it too difficult. I must get a light. It is getting too dark to see," said Peter's mother, who was still busy mending his waistcoat. "I feel too as if the afternoon had gone I hardly know how." Heidi now jumped up from her low chair, and holding out her hand hastily to the grandmother said, "Good night, grandmother. If it is getting dark I must go home at once." And bidding goodbye to Peter and his mother she went towards the door, but the grandmother called out in an anxious voice, "Wait, wait, Heidi, you must not go alone like that. Peter must go with you, and take care of the child, Peter, that she does not fall, and don't let her stand still for fear she should get frozen. Do you hear? Has she got anything warm to put around her throat?" "I have not anything to put on," called back Heidi, "but I am sure I shall not be cold." And with that she ran outside and went off at such a pace that Peter had difficulty in overtaking her. The grandmother, still in distress, called out to her daughter, "Run after her, Brigida. The child will be frozen to death on such a night as this. Take my shawl. Run quickly." Brigida ran out, but the children had taken but a few steps before they saw the grandfather coming down to meet them, and in another minute his long strides had brought him to their side. "That's right, Heidi, you have kept your word," said the grandfather, and then wrapping the sack firmly round her he lifted her in his arms and strode off with her up the mountain. Brigida was just in time to see him do all this, and on her return to the hut with Peter expressed her astonishment to the grandmother. The latter was equally surprised, and kept on saying, "God be thanked that he is good to the child. God be thanked. Will he let her come to me again? I wonder the child has done me so much good. What a loving little heart it is, and how merrily she tells her tale." And she continued to dwell with delight on the thought of the child until she went to bed, still saying now and again, "If only she will come again, now I have really something left in the world to take pleasure in." And Brigida agreed with all her mother said, and Peter nodded his head in approval each time his grandmother spoke, saying, with a broad smile of satisfaction, "I told you so." Meanwhile Heidi was chattering away to her grandfather from inside her sack. Her voice, however, could not reach him through the many thick folds of her wrap, and as therefore it was impossible to understand a word she was saying, he called to her, "Wait till we get home, and then you can tell me all about it." They had no sooner got inside the hut than Heidi, having been released from her covering, at once began what she had to say. "Grandfather, tomorrow we must take the hammer and the long nails and fasten grandmother's shutter, and drive in a lot more nails in other places, for her house shakes and rattles all over. We must we?" "Who told you that?" asked her grandfather. "Nobody told me, but I know it for all that," replied Heidi, "for everything is giving way. And when the grandmother cannot sleep, she lies trembling for fear at the noise, for she thinks that every minute the house will fall down on their heads, and everything now is dark for grandmother, and she does not think anyone can make it light for her again. But you will be able to, I am sure, grandfather. Think how dreadful it is for her to be always in the dark, and then to be frightened at what may happen. And nobody can help her but you. Tomorrow we must go and help her. We will, won't we, grandfather?" The child was clinging to the old man and looking up at him in trustful confidence. The grandfather looked down at Heidi for a while without speaking, and then said, "Yes, Heidi, we will do something to stop the rattling. At least we can do that. We will go down about it tomorrow." The child went skipping round the room for joy, crying out, "We shall go tomorrow, we shall go tomorrow." The grandfather kept his promise. On the following afternoon he brought the sleigh out again, and as on the previous day, he set Heidi down at the door of the grandmother's hut and said, "Go in now, and when it grows dark, come out again." Then he put the sack in the sleigh and went round the house. Heidi had hardly opened the door and sprung into the room when the grandmother called out from her corner, "It's the child again, here she comes." And in her delight she let the thread drop from her fingers, and the wheel stood still as she stretched out both her hands in welcome. Heidi ran to her, and then quickly drew the little stool close up to the old woman, and seating herself upon it, began to tell and ask her all kinds of things. All at once came the sound of heavy blows against the wall of the hut, and the grandmother gave such a start of alarm that she nearly upset the spinning wheel, and cried in a trembling voice, "Ah, my God, now it is coming. The house is going to fall upon us." But Heidi caught her by the arm, and said soothingly, "No, no, grandmother, do not be frightened. It is only grandfather with his hammer. He is mending up everything, so that you shan't have such fear and trouble." "Is it possible, is it really possible, so the dear God has not forgotten us?" exclaimed the grandmother. "Do you hear, Brigida, what that noise is? Did you hear what the child says? Now, as I listen, I can tell it is a hammer. Go outside, Brigida, and if it is uncle, tell him he must come inside a moment that I may thank him." Brigida went outside and found uncle in the act of fastening some heavy pieces of new wood along the wall. She stepped up to him and said, "Good evening, uncle. Mother and I have to thank you for doing us such a kind service, and she would like to tell you herself how grateful she is. I do not know who else would have done it for us. We shall not forget your kindness, for I am sure that will do," said the old man, interrupting her. "I know what you think of uncle without your telling me. Go indoors again. I can find out for myself where the mending is wanted." Brigida obeyed on the spot, for uncle had a way with him that made few people care to oppose his will. He went on knocking with his hammer all round the house, and then mounted the narrow steps to the roof, and hammered away there, until he had used up all the nails he had brought with him. Meanwhile it had been growing dark, and he had hardly come down from the roof and dragged the sleigh out from behind the goat shed when Heidi appeared outside. The grandfather wrapped her up and took her in his arms as he had done the day before, for although he had to drag the sleigh up the mountain after him, he feared that if the child sat in it alone her wrappings would fall off and that she would be nearly if not quite frozen, so he carried her warm and safe in his arms. So the winter went by. After many years of joyless life, the blind grandmother had at last found something to make her happy. Her days were no longer passed in weariness and darkness, one like the other without pleasure or change, for now she had always something to which she could look forward. She listened for the little tripping footstep as soon as day had come, and when she heard the door open and knew the child was really there, she would call out, "God be thanked, she has come again," and Heidi would sit by her and talk and tell her everything she knew in so lively a manner that the grandmother never noticed how the time went by, and never now as formerly asked Brigida, "Isn't the day done yet?" but as the child shut the door behind her on leaving, would exclaim, "How short the afternoon has seemed, don't you think so, Brigida?" And this one would answer, "I do indeed. It seems as if I had only just cleared away the midday meal, And the grandmother would continue, "Pray God the child is not taken from me, and that uncle continues to let her come. Does she look well and strong?" Brigida and the latter would answer, "She looks as bright and rosy as an apple." And Heidi had also grown very fond of the old grandmother, and when at last she knew for certain that no one could make it light for her again, she was overcome with sorrow. But the grandmother told her again that she felt the darkness much less when Heidi was with her, and so every fine winter's day the child came traveling down in her sleigh. The grandfather always took her, never raising any objection. Indeed, he always carried the hammer and sundry other things down in the sleigh with him, and many an afternoon was spent by him in making the goatherd's cottage sound and tight. It no longer groaned and rattled the whole night through, and the grandmother, who for many winters had not been able to sleep in peace as she did now, said she should never forget what the uncle had done for her. Chapter 5. 2 Visits and What Came of Them. Quickly the winter passed, and still more quickly the bright glad summer, and now another winter was drawing to its close. Heidi was still as light-hearted and happy as the birds, and looked forward with more delight each day to the coming spring, when the warm south wind would roar through the fir trees and blow away the snow, and the warm sun would entice the blue and yellow flowers to show their heads, and the long days out on the mountain would come again, which seemed to Heidi the greatest joy that the earth could give. Heidi was now in her 8th year. She had learnt all kinds of useful things from her grandfather. She knew how to look after the goats as well as anyone, and little Swan and Bear would follow her like 2 faithful dogs, and give a loud bleat of pleasure when they heard her voice. Twice during the course of this last winter Peter had brought up a message from the schoolmaster at Dorfli, who sent word to Uncle that he ought to send Heidi to school, as she was over the usual age, and ought indeed to have gone the winter before. Uncle had sent word back each time that the schoolmaster would find him at home if he had anything he wished to say to him, but that he did not intend to send Heidi to school, and Peter had faithfully delivered his message. When the March sun had melted the snow on the mountainside and the snowdrops were peeping out all over the valley, and the fir trees had shaken off their burden of snow and were again merrily waving their branches in the air, Heidi ran backwards and forwards with delight, first to the goat shed, then to the fir trees, and then to the hut door, in order to let her grandfather know how much larger a piece of green there was under the trees, and then would run off to look again, for she could hardly wait till everything was green and the full beautiful summer had clothed the mountain with grass and flowers. As Heidi was thus running about one sunny March morning, and had just jumped over the water trough for the 10th time at least, she nearly fell backwards into it with fright, for there in front of her, looking gravely at her, stood an old gentleman dressed in black. When he saw how startled she was, he said in a kind voice, "Don't be afraid of me, for I am very fond of children. Shake hands. You must be the Heidi I have heard of. Where is your grandfather?" "He is sitting by the table, making round wooden spoons," Heidi informed him, as she opened the door. He was the old village pastor from Dorfli, who had been a neighbor of Uncle's when he lived down there, and had known him well. He stepped inside the hut, and going up to the old man, who was bending over his work, said, "Good morning, neighbor." The grandfather looked up in surprise, and then rising said, "Good morning" in return. He pushed his chair towards the visitor as he continued, "If you do not mind a wooden seat, there is one for you." The pastor sat down. "It is a long time since I have seen you, neighbor," he said. "Or are you?" was the answer. "I have come today to talk over something with you," continued the pastor. "I think you know already what it is that has brought me here." And as he spoke he looked towards the child who was standing at the door, gazing with interest and surprise at the stranger. "Heidi, go off to the goats," said her grandfather. "You take them a little salt and stay with them till I come." Heidi vanished on the spot. The child ought to have been at school a year ago, and most certainly this last winter, said the pastor. "The schoolmaster sent you word about it, but you gave him no answer. What are you thinking of doing with the child?" "Neighbor, I am thinking of not sending her to school," was the answer. The visitor, surprised, looked across at the old man, who was sitting on his bench with his arms crossed and a determined expression about his whole person. "How are you going to let her grow up then?" he asked. "I am going to let her grow up and be happy among the goats and birds. With them she is safe, and will learn nothing evil. But the child is not a goat or a bird. She is a human being. If she learns no evil from these comrades of hers, she will at the same time learn nothing. But she ought not to grow up in ignorance, and it is time she began her lessons. I have come now that you may have leisure to think over it, and to arrange about it during the summer. This is the last winter that she must be allowed to run wild. Next winter she must come regularly to school every day." "She will do no such thing," said the old man with calm determination. "Do you mean that by no persuasion can you be brought to see reason, and that you intend to stick obstinately to your decision?" said the pastor, growing somewhat angry. "You have been about the world, and must have seen and learnt much, and I should have given you credit for more sense." "Neighbor, indeed," replied the old man, and there was a tone in his voice that betrayed a growing irritation on his part too. "And does the worthy pastor really mean that he would wish me next winter to send a young child like that some miles down the mountain on ice-cold mornings through storm and snow, and let her return at night when the wind is raging, when even one like ourselves would run a risk of being blown down by it and buried in the snow? And perhaps he may not have forgotten the child's mother, Adelaide? She was a sleepwalker, and had fits. Might not the child be attacked in the same way if obliged to overexert herself? And someone thinks they can come and force me to send her? I will go before all the courts of justice in the country, and then we shall see who will force me to do it." "You are quite right, neighbor," said the pastor in a friendly tone of voice. "I see it would have been impossible to send the child to school from here, but I perceive that the child is dear to you. For her sake do what you ought to have done long ago. Come down into Dorfley and live again among your fellow men. What sort of a life is this you led, alone, and with bitter thoughts towards God and man? If anything were to happen to you up here, who would there be to help you? I cannot think but what you must be half frozen to death in this hut in the winter, and I do not know how the child lives through it. The child has young blood in her veins and a good roof over her head. And let me further tell the pastor that I know where wood is to be found, and when is the proper time to fetch it. The pastor can go and look inside my woodshed. The fire is never out in my hut the whole winter through. As to going to live below, that is far from my thoughts. The people despise me and I them. It is therefore best for all of us that we live apart." No, it is not best for you. I know what it is you lack," said the pastor in an earnest voice. "As to the people down there looking on you with dislike, it is not as bad as you think. Believe me, neighbor, seek to make your peace with God, pray for forgiveness where you need it, and then come and see how differently people will look upon you, and how happy you may yet be." The pastor had risen and stood holding out his hand to the old man as he added with renewed earnestness, "I will wager, neighbor, that next winter you will be down among us again, and we shall be good neighbors as of old. I should be very grieved if any pressure had to be put upon you. Give me your hand and promise me that you will come and live with us again and become reconciled to God and man." Uncle gave the pastor his hand and answered him calmly and firmly, You mean well by me, I know, but as to that which you wish me to do, I say now what I shall continue to say, that I will not send the child to school nor come and live among you." "Then God help you," said the pastor, and he turned sadly away and left their hut and went down the mountain. Uncle was out of humor. When Heidi said as usual that afternoon, "Can we go down to grandmother now?" he answered, "Not today." He did not speak again the whole of that day, and the following morning when Heidi again asked the same question, he replied, "We will see." But before the dinner bowls had been cleared away another visitor arrived, and this time it was Cousin Deet. She had a fine feathered hat on her head, and a long trailing skirt to her dress which swept the floor, and on the floor of a goatherd's hut there are all sorts of things that do not belong to a dress. The grandfather looked her up and down without uttering a word. But Deet was prepared with an exceedingly amiable speech and began at once to praise the looks of the child. She was looking so well she should hardly have known her again, and it was evident that she had been happy and well cared for with her grandfather, but she had never lost sight of the idea of taking the child back again, for she well understood that the little one must be much in his way, but she had not been able to do it at first. Day and night, however, she had thought over the means of placing the child somewhere, and that was why she had come today, for she had just heard of something that would be a lucky chance for Heidi beyond her most ambitious hopes. Some immensely wealthy relatives of the people she was serving, who had the most splendid house almost in Frankfurt, had an only daughter, young and an invalid, who was always obliged to go about in a wheelchair. She was therefore very much alone and had no one to share her lessons, and so the little girl felt dull. Her father had spoken to Deet's mistress about finding a companion for her, and her mistress was anxious to help in the matter, as she felt so sympathetic about it. The lady housekeeper had described the sort of child they wanted, simple-minded and unspoilt, and not like most of the children that one saw nowadays. Deet had thought at once of Heidi and had gone off without delay to see the lady housekeeper, and after Deet had given her a description of Heidi, she had immediately agreed to take her, and no one could tell what good fortune there might not be in store for Heidi, for if she was once with these people and they took a fancy to her, and anything happened to their own daughter, one could never tell. The child was so weakly, and they did not feel they could live without a child. Why then the most unheard of luck. "Have you nearly finished what you had to say?" broke in Uncle, who had allowed her to talk on uninterruptedly so far. "Ugh!" exclaimed Deet, throwing up her head in disgust. "One would think I had been talking to you about the most ordinary matter. Why, there is not one person in all Pradaga who would not thank God if I were to bring them such a piece of news as I am bringing you. You may take your news to anybody you like. I will have nothing to do with it." But now Deet leaped up from her seat like a rocket and cried, "If that is all you have to say about it, why then I will give you a bit of my mind. The child is now 8 years old and knows nothing, and you will not let her learn. You will not send her to church or school, as I was told down in Dorfli, and she is my own sister's child. I am responsible for what happens to her, and when there is such a good opening for a child, as this which offers for Heidi, only a person who cares for nobody and never wishes good to anyone would think of not jumping at it. But I am not going to give in, and that I tell you. I have everybody in Dorfli on my side. There is not one person there who will not take my part against you, and I advise you to think well before bringing it into court, if that is your intention. There are certain things which might be brought up against you which you would not care to hear, for when one has to do with law courts there is a great deal raked up that had been forgotten." "Be silent," thundered the uncle, and his eyes flashed with anger. Go and be done with you, and never let me see you again with your hat and feather, and such words on your tongue as you come with today." And with that he strode out of the hut. "You have made grandfather angry," said Heidi, and her dark eyes had anything but a friendly expression in them as she looked at Deet. "He will soon be all right again. Come now," said Deet hurriedly, "and show me where your clothes are." "I am not coming," said Heidi. "Nonsense," continued Deet, then altering her tone to one half coaxing, half cross. "Come, come. You do not understand any better than your grandfather. You will have all sorts of good things that you never dreamed of." Then she went to the cupboard and taking out Heidi's things rolled them up in a bundle. "Come along now. There's your hat. It is very shabby but will do for the present. Put it on and let us make haste off." "I am not coming," repeated Heidi. "Don't be so stupid and obstinate, like a goat. I suppose it's from the goats you have learned to be so. Listen to me. You saw your grandfather was angry and heard what he said, that he did not wish to see us ever again. He wants you now to go away with me, and you must not make him angrier still. You can't think how nice it is at Frankfurt, and what a lot of things you will see, and if you do not like it you can come back again. Your grandfather will be in a good temper again by that time." "Can I return at once and be back home again here this evening?" asked Heidi. "What are you talking about? Come along now. I tell you that you can come back here when you like. Today we shall go as far as Mayenfold, and early tomorrow we shall start in the train, and that will bring you home again in no time when you wish it, for it goes as fast as the wind." Deet had now got the bundle under her arm and the child by the hand, and so they went down the mountain together. As it was still too early in the year to take his goats out, Peter continued to go to school at Dorfli, but now and again he stole a holiday, for he could see no use in learning to read, while to wander about a bit and look for stout sticks which might be wanted some day he thought a far better employment. As Deet and Heidi neared the grandmother's hut they met Peter coming round the corner. He had evidently been well rewarded that day for his labors, for he was carrying an immense bundle of long thick hazel sticks on his shoulders. He stood still and stared at the two approaching figures. As they came up to him, he exclaimed, "Where are you going?" "Heidi, I am only just going over to Frankfurt for a little visit with Deet," she replied, "but I must first run into grandmother. She will be expecting me." "No, no, you must not stop to talk. It is already too late," said Deet, holding Heidi, who was struggling to get away, fast by the hand. "You can go in when you come back. You must come along now." And she pulled the child on with her, fearing that if she let her go in Heidi might take it into her head again that she did not wish to come, and that the grandmother might stand by her. Peter ran into the hut and banged against the table with his bundle of sticks with such violence that everything in the room shook, and his grandmother leaped up with a cry of alarm from her spinning wheel. Peter had felt that he must give vent to his feelings somehow. "What is the matter? What is the matter?" cried the frightened old woman, while his mother, who had also started up from her seat at the shock, said in her usual patient manner, "What is it, Peter? Why do you behave so roughly?" "Because she is taking Heidi away," explained Peter. Who where to?" "Peter, where to?" asked the grandmother, growing still more agitated. But even as she spoke she guessed what had happened, for Brigitte had told her shortly before that she had seen Deet going up to Uncle. The old woman rose hastily and with trembling hands opened the window and called out beseechingly, "Deet, Deet, do not take the child away from us. Do not take her away." The two who were hastening down the mountain heard her voice, and Deet evidently caught the words, for she grasped Heidi's hand more firmly. Heidi struggled to get free, crying, "Grandmother is calling. I must go to her." But Dete had no intention of letting the child go, and quieted her as best she could. "They must make haste now," she said, "or they would be too late and not able to go on the next day to Frankfurt, and there the child would see how delightful it was, and Dete was sure would not wish to go back when she was once there. But if Heidi wanted to return home she could do so at once, and then she could take something she liked back to grandmother. This was a new idea to Heidi, and it pleased her so much that Dete had no longer any difficulty in getting her along. After a few minutes' silence, Heidi asked, "What could I take back to her?" "We must think of something nice," answered Dete. "A soft roll of white bread. She would enjoy that, for now she is old she can hardly eat the hard, black bread. No, she always gives it back to Peter, telling him it is too hard, for I have seen her do it myself," affirmed Heidi. "Do let us make haste, for then perhaps we can get back soon from Frankfurt, and I shall be able to give her the white bread today." And Heidi started off running so fast that Dete with the bundle under her arm could scarcely keep up with her. But she was glad, nevertheless, to get along so quickly, for they were nearing Dorfli, where her friends would probably talk and question in a way that might put other ideas into Heidi's head. So she went on straight ahead through the village, holding Heidi tightly by the hand, so that they might all see that it was on the child's account she was hurrying along at such a rate. To all their questions and remarks she made answer as she passed, "I can't stop now. As you see, I must make haste with the child as we have yet some way to go." "Are you taking her away? Is she running away from Uncle? It's a wonder she is still alive. But what rosy cheeks she has." Such were the words which rang out on all sides, and Dete was thankful that she had not to stop and give any distinct answers to them, while Heidi hurried eagerly forward without saying a word. From that day forward Uncle looked fiercer and more forbidding than ever when he came down and passed through Dorfli. He spoke to no one, and looked such an ogre as he came along with his pack of cheeses on his back, his immense stick in his hand, and his thick, frowning eyebrows, that the women would call to their little ones, "Take care, get out of Uncle's way or he may hurt you." The old man took no notice of anybody as he strode through the village on his way to the valley below, where he sold his cheeses and bought what bread and meat he wanted for himself. After he had passed, the villagers all crowded together looking after him, and each had something to say about him. How much wilder he looked than usual, how now he would not even respond to anybody's greeting, while they all agreed that it was a great mercy the child had got away from him. And had they not all noticed how the child had hurried along as if afraid that her grandfather might be following to take her back? Only the blind grandmother would have nothing to say against him, and told those who came to her to bring her work, or take away what she had spun. How kind and thoughtful he had been with the child, how good to her and her daughter, and how many afternoons he had spent mending the house which, but for his help, would certainly by this time have fallen down over their heads. And all this was repeated down in Dorfli, but most of the people who heard it said that grandmother was too old to understand, and very likely had not heard rightly what was said. As she was blind she was probably also deaf. Uncle went no more now to the grandmother's house, and it was well that he had made it so safe, for it was not touched again for a long time. The days were sad again now for the old blind woman, and not one passed but what she would murmur complainingly, "Alice, all our happiness and pleasure have gone with the child, and now the days are so long and dreary. Pray God, I see Heidi again once more before I die." Chapter 6. A new chapter about new things. In her home at Frankfurt, Clara, the little daughter of Herr Sesselmann, was lying on the invalid couch on which she spent her whole day, being wheeled in it from room to room. Just now she was in what was known as the study, where, to judge by the various things standing and lying about, which added to the cozy appearance of the room, the family was fond of sitting. A handsome bookcase with glass doors explained why it was called the study, and here evidently the little girl was accustomed to have her lessons. Clara's little face was thin and pale, and at this moment her two soft blue eyes were fixed on the clock, which seemed to her to go very slowly this day, and with a slight accent of impatience, which was very rare with her, she asked, "Isn't it time yet?" Fräulein Rottenmeier. This lady was sitting very upright at a small work table, busy with her embroidery. She had on a mysterious-looking loose garment, a large collar or shoulder cape that gave a certain solemnity to her appearance, which was enhanced by a very lofty dome-shaped headdress. For many years past, since the mistress of the house had died, the housekeeping and the superintendence of the servants had been entrusted by Herr Sesemann to Fräulein Rottenmeier. He himself was often away from home, and he left her in sole charge, with the condition only that his little daughter should have a voice in all matters, and that nothing should be done against her wish. As Clara was putting her impatient question for the second time, Jeet and Heidi arrived at the front door, and the former inquired of the coachman, who had just got down from his box, if it was too late to see Fräulein Rottenmeier. "That's not my business," grumbled the coachman. "Ring the bell in the hall for Sebastian." Jeet did so, and Sebastian came downstairs. He looked astonished when he saw her, opening his eyes till they were nearly as big as the large round buttons on his coat. "Is it too late for me to see Fräulein Rottenmeier?" Jeet asked again. "That's not my business," answered the man. "Ring that other bell for the maid Jeanette," and without troubling himself any farther Sebastian disappeared. Jeet rang again. This time Jeanette appeared with a spotless white cap perched on the top of her head and a mocking expression of face. "What is it?" she called from the top of the stairs. Jeet repeated her question. Jeanette disappeared, but soon came back and called down again to Jeet. "Come up. She is expecting you." Jeet and Heidi went upstairs and into the study, Jeanette following. Jeet remained standing politely near the door, still holding Heidi tightly by the hand, for she did not know what the child might take it into her head to do amid these new surroundings. Fräulein Rottenmeier rose slowly and went up to the little new companion for the daughter of the house, to see what she was like. She did not seem very pleased with her appearance. Heidi was dressed in her plain little woolen frock, and her hat was an old straw one bent out of shape. The child looked innocently out from beneath it, gazing with unconcealed astonishment at the lady's towering headdress. "What is your name?" asked Fräulein Rottenmeier, after scrutinizingly examining the child for some minutes, while Heidi in return kept her eyes steadily fixed upon the lady. "Heidi," she answered in a clear, ringing voice. What that's no Christian name for a child. You were not christened that." "What name did they give you when you were baptized?" continued Fräulein Rottenmeier. "I do not remember," replied Heidi. "What a way to answer," said the lady, shaking her head. "Jeet, is the child a simpleton or only saucy? If the lady will allow me, I will speak for the child, for she is very unaccustomed to strangers," said Jeet, who had given Heidi a silent poke for making such an unsuitable answer. "She is certainly not stupid nor yet saucy. She does not know what it means even. She speaks exactly as she thinks. Today she is for the first time in a gentleman's house and she does not know good manners, but she is docile and very willing to learn, if the lady will kindly make excuses for her. She was christened Adelaide, after her mother, my sister, who is now dead." "Well, that's a name that one can pronounce," remarked Fräulein Rottenmeier. "But I must tell you, Deet, that I am astonished to see so young a child. I told you that I wanted a companion of the same age as the young lady of the house, one who could share her lessons, and all her other occupations. Fräulein Clara is now over 12. What age is this child? If the lady will allow me, began Deet again, in her usual fluent manner. I myself had lost count of her exact age. She is certainly a little younger, but not much. I cannot say precisely, but I think she is 10, or thereabouts. Grandfather told me I was 8, put in HEIDI. Deet gave her another poke, but as the child had not the least idea why she did so, she was not at all confused. What? Only 8? Cried Fräulein Wertenmeier angrily. 4 years too young. Of what use is such a child? And what have you learnt? What books did you have to learn from? None, said HEIDI. How what? How then did you learn to read? Continued the lady. I have never learned to read, or Peter either, HEIDI informed her. Mercy upon us, you do not know how to read. Is it really so? Exclaimed Fräulein Wertenmeier, greatly horrified. Is it possible? Not able to read? What have you learnt then? Nothing, said HEIDI with unflinching truthfulness. Young woman, said the lady to Deet, after having paused for a minute or two to recover from her shock. This is not at all the sort of companion you led me to suppose. How could you think of bringing me a child like this? But Deet was not to be put down so easily, and answered warmly, if the lady will allow me, the child is exactly what I thought she required. The lady described what she wished for, a child unlike all other children, and I could find no other to suit, for the greater number I know are not peculiar, but one very much the same as the other, and I thought this child seemed as if made for the place. But I must go now, for my mistress will be waiting for me. If the lady will permit, I will come again soon and see how she is getting on. And with a bow, Deet quickly left the room and ran downstairs. Fräulein Wertenmeier stood for a moment taken aback and then ran after Deet. If the child was to stop, she had many things yet to say and ask about her. And there the child was. And what was more, Deet, as she plainly saw, meant to leave her there. HEIDI remained by the door where she had been standing since she first came in. Clara had looked on during the interview without speaking. Now she beckoned to HEIDI and said, "Come here." HEIDI went up to her. "Would you rather be called HEIDI or Adelaide?" asked Clara. "I am never called anything but HEIDI," was the child's prompt answer. "Then I shall always call you by that name," said Clara. "It suits you. I have never heard it before, but neither have I ever seen a child like you before. Have you always had that short curly hair?" "Yes, I think so," said HEIDI. "Are you pleased to come to Frankfurt?" went on Clara. "No, but I shall go home tomorrow and take grandmother a white loaf," explained HEIDI. "Well, you are a funny child," exclaimed Clara. "You were expressly sent for to come here and to remain with me and share my lessons. There will be some fun about them now, as you cannot read. Something new to do, for often they are dreadfully dull, and I think the morning will never pass away. You know my tutor comes every morning at about 10 o'clock, and then we go on with lessons till 2, and it does seem such a long time. Sometimes he takes up the book and holds it close up to his face, as if he was very short-sighted, but I know it's only because he wants so dreadfully to gape." And Fräulein Wertenmeier takes her large handkerchief out also now and then and covers her face with it, as if she was moved by what we had been reading. But that is only because she is longing to gape too, and I myself often want to gape, but I am obliged to stop myself, for if Fräulein Wertenmeier sees me gaping, she runs off at once and fetches the cod liver oil and says I must have a dose, as I am getting weak again, and the cod liver oil is horrible, so I do my best not to gape. but now it will be much more amusing, for I shall be able to lie and listen while you learn to read." Heidi shook her head doubtfully when she heard of learning to read. "Oh, nonsense, Heidi. Of course you must learn to read. Everybody must. And my tutor is very kind, and never cross, and he will explain everything to you. But mind, when he explains anything to you, you won't be able to understand. But don't ask any questions, or else he will go on explaining and you will understand less than ever. Later, when you have learned more and know about things yourself, then you will begin to understand what he meant." Fräulein Rottenmeier now came back into the room. She had not been able to overtake Diet, and was evidently very much put out, for she had wanted to go into more details concerning the child, and to convince Diet how misleading she had been, and how unfit Heidi was as a companion for Clara. She really did not know what to be about, or how to undo the mischief, and it made her all the more angry that she herself was responsible for it. Having consented to Heidi being fetched, she ran backwards and forwards in a state of agitation between the study and the dining room, and then began scolding Sebastian, who was standing looking at the table he had just finished laying to see that nothing was missing. "You can finish your thoughts tomorrow morning. Make haste, or we shall get no dinner today at all." Then hurrying out she called to Nat, but in such an ill-tempered voice that the maid came tripping forward with even more mincing steps than usual. But she looked so pert that even Fräulein Rottenmeier did not venture to scold her, which only made her suppressed anger the greater. "See that the room is prepared for the little girl who has just arrived," said the lady, with a violent effort at self-control. "Everything is ready. It only wants dusting." "It's worth my troubling about," said Jeanette mockingly as she turned away. Meanwhile Sebastian had flung open the folding doors leading into the dining room with rather more noise than he need, for he was feeling furious, although he did not dare answer back when Fräulein Rottenmeier spoke to him. He then went up to Clara's chair to wheel her into the next room. As he was arranging the handle at the back preparatory to doing so, Heidi went near and stood staring at him. Seeing her eyes fixed upon him, he suddenly growled out, "Well, what is there in me to stare at like that?" which he would certainly not have done if he had been aware that Fräulein Rottenmeier was just then entering the room. "You look so like Peter," answered Heidi. The lady housekeeper clasped her hands in horror. "Is it possible?" she stammered half aloud. She is now addressing the servant as if he were a friend. "I never could have imagined such a child." Sebastian wheeled the couch into the dining room and helped Clara onto her chair. Fräulein Rottenmeier took the seat beside her and made a sign to Heidi to take the one opposite. They were the only three at table, and as they sat far apart there was plenty of room for Sebastian to hand his dishes. Beside Heidi's plate lay a nice white roll, and her eyes lighted up with pleasure as she saw it. The resemblance which Heidi had noticed had evidently awakened in her a feeling of confidence towards Sebastian, for she sat as still as a mouse and without moving until he came up to her side and handed her the dish of fish. Then she looked at the roll and asked, "Can I have it?" Sebastian nodded, throwing a side glance at Fräulein Rottenmeier to see what effect this request would have upon her. Heidi immediately seized the roll and put it in her pocket. Sebastian's face became convulsed. He was overcome with inward laughter but knew his place too well to laugh aloud. Mute and motionless he still remained standing beside Heidi. It was not his duty to speak, nor to move away until she had helped herself. Heidi looked wonderingly at him for a minute or two, and then said, "Am I to eat some of that too?" Sebastian nodded again. "Give me some then," she said, looking calmly at her plate. At this Sebastian's command of his countenance became doubtful. and the dish began to tremble suspiciously in his hands. "You can put the dish on the table and come back presently," said Fräulein Rottenmeier with a severe expression of face. Sebastian disappeared on the spot. "As for you, Adelaide, I see I shall have to teach you the first rules of behavior," continued the lady housekeeper with a sigh. "I will begin by explaining to you how you are to conduct yourself at table." And she went on to give Heidi minute instructions as to all she was to do. "And now," she continued, "I must make you particularly understand that you are not to speak to Sebastian at table, or at any other time, unless you have an order to give him, or a necessary question to put to him, and then you are not to address him as if he was someone belonging to you. Never let me hear you speak to him in that way again. It is the same with Toinette, and for myself you are to address me as you hear others doing." Clara must herself decide what you are to call her. "Why, Clara, of course," put the latter. Then followed a long list of rules as to general behavior: getting up and going to bed, going in and out of the room, shutting the doors, keeping everything tidy, during the course of which Heidi's eyes gradually closed, for she had been up before 5 o'clock that morning and had had a long journey. She leant back in her chair and fell fast asleep. Fräulein Rottenmeier, having at last come to the end of her sermonizing, said, "Now remember what I have said, Adelaide. Have you understood it all?" "Heidi has been asleep for ever so long," said Clara, her face rippling all over with amusement, for she had not had such an entertaining dinner for a long time. "It is really insupportable what one has to go through with this child," exclaimed Fräulein Rottenmeier, in great indignation, and she rang the bell so violently that Toinette and Sebastian both came running in and nearly tumbling over one another. But no noise was sufficient to wake Heidi, and it was with difficulty they could rouse her sufficiently to get her along to her bedroom, to reach which she had to pass first through the study, then through Clara's bedroom, then through Fräulein Rottenmeier's sitting room, till she came to the corner room that had been set apart for her.